November 1894, the Appalachian Mountains. The snow came early that year. By the first week of November, the peaks of the Blue Ridge were already blanketed in white, and the narrow dirt roads that snaked through the hollows had turned into rivers of frozen mud. The old-timers said it was a bad omen, winter arriving before its time, animals acting strange. Deer found frozen in clearings with their eyes wide open, as if they'd seen something that stopped their hearts mid-flight. In the town of Crow's Hollow, population 347 souls, the cold settled into the bones of the wooden buildings like a living thing. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray columns that barely disturbed the oppressive silence. The town sat in a valley so deep that sunlight only reached the main street for 3 hours a day, even in summer. Now, in the grip of this premature winter, darkness ruled nearly 20 hours out of every 24. Crow's Hollow was a place people passed through, not a place they chose to stay. It had been a mining town once back in the 70s, when rumors of coal brought fortune seekers from as far as Pennsylvania and Ohio. But the seams ran shallow, and the men who came left just as quickly, leaving behind empty shacks and broken dreams. What remained was a skeletal community of trappers, subsistence farmers, and those too poor or too stubborn to leave. The town had no telegraph office, no railroad station. The nearest city, Asheville, was 43 miles south on roads that became impassable for weeks at a time during heavy snow. Mail came twice a month if the weather held. Otherwise, Crow's Hollow existed in a pocket of time all its own, disconnected from the modern world that was rapidly changing beyond the mountains. On November 14, 1894, a traveling photographer arrived in town. His name was Thomas Blackwell, and he came in a black carriage pulled by 2 horses that looked as tired as the man himself. Blackwell was 46 years old, though his weathered face suggested a harder life than his years accounted for. He wore a long wool coat that had seen better days, a bowler hat pushed low over his brow, and wire-rimmed spectacles that constantly slid down his thin nose. His hands were stained with chemicals, silver nitrate, collodion, developer solutions, the marks of his trade. Blackwell set up shop in the back room of Harlan's General Store, the only establishment in Crow's Hollow that stayed open past sunset. The store owner, Moses Harlan, was a broad-shouldered man with a perpetual scowl and a reputation for fair dealing, which in these mountains meant he'd cheat you a little less than everyone else. "$1 a photograph," Blackwell announced, spreading a canvas backdrop against the store's rear wall. Family portraits, individual portraits, group photographs, all permanent images on glass plate, memories that will outlast your grandchildren. In 1894, photography was still something of a marvel in isolated places like Crow's Hollow. Most folks had never seen their own faces captured in such detail. Mirrors were expensive and rare. For many mountain people, a photograph was the closest thing to immortality they'd ever know. Word spread quickly through the hollow. By evening, a line had formed outside Harlan's store. Families clutching their Sunday best clothes, young couples wanting to commemorate betrothals, old women who wanted one final image before they met their maker. Blackwell worked methodically, positioning his subjects, adjusting the light from oil lamps, disappearing beneath the black cloth that shrouded his camera. Among those who came was the Hutchins family. Robert Hutchins was 38, a trapper who worked the high country with his 2 grown sons. His wife, Martha, had died giving birth to their youngest child 7 years prior. The baby had died too, wrapped in stillborn silence. Robert had never remarried. He raised his 3 surviving children alone in a cabin 4 miles up the mountain, past where the road ended, and the forest grew so thick that noon looked like twilight. His eldest, Jacob, was 19, tall and raw-boned, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's grim silence. He rarely came to town, preferring the company of trees and animals to people. The middle child, Rebecca, was 16. She had a delicate face that seemed out of place in these hard mountains. With auburn hair she kept braided tight and green eyes that adults said were too knowing for a girl her age. She could read and write, unusual for girls in the Hollow, taught by her mother before the final pregnancy took her. The youngest, Samuel, was 12, small for his age, with a wandering left eye and a stutter that made other children mock him. He kept a collection of bird skulls in his pockets and talked to himself when he thought no one was listening. Robert wanted a family photograph, something to remember them by, he told Blackwell, though he didn't say what he thought might make them need remembering. Blackwell arranged them carefully. Robert seated in the center, stern and unsmiling. Jacob standing behind his father's right shoulder, hand resting on the chair back. Rebecca to the left, standing straight, hands clasped at her waist. And young Samuel seated on a stool at his father's feet, forced to hold still despite his nervous energy. "Don't move," Blackwell instructed from beneath his black cloth. "Not even to breathe. Hold perfectly still for 10 seconds. The magnesium flash powder ignited with a pop and a burst of acrid white smoke. The family held their positions like statues. Samuel's wandering eye rolled slightly toward something outside the frame. Rebecca's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly. Jacob's jaw clenched. "Done," Blackwell announced. "Come back tomorrow afternoon. Your photograph will be ready." The Hutchins family paid their $1 and left in silence, walking back into the November darkness that swallowed them before they reached the edge of town. That night, something happened. Blackwell developed his photographs in the chemical baths he'd set up in Harlan's back room. The process was toxic and slow. Glass plates submerged in silver solution, then exposed to light, then fixed in sodium thiosulfate. One by one, the images emerged like ghosts materializing from fog. He processed the Hutchins family photograph last. When he lifted the glass plate from the final bath and held it up to the lamplight, he saw them there, Robert, Jacob, Rebecca, Samuel, frozen in their positions, captured for eternity. But as he examined the image more closely, tilting the plate to catch the light at different angles, he noticed something that made his hands begin to shake. In the background, barely visible in the shadows behind where the family sat, there was a figure. It shouldn't have been there. Blackwell remembered the room clearly. Empty except for the family and himself. The canvas backdrop, the oil lamps, nothing else. But in the photograph, standing in the darkened corner of the room, partially obscured by shadow, there was undeniably the outline of a person, small, child-sized perhaps, with something wrong about the proportions. The head too large, the arms too long. Blackwell leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. The figure appeared to be looking directly at the camera. Or more precisely, it seemed to be looking at young Samuel, whose wandering eye had drifted toward that exact spot in the room during the exposure. The photographer felt a cold thread of unease work its way down his spine. In his 23 years of taking photographs, he'd seen optical illusions before. Light playing tricks. Shadows forming shapes that the mind interpreted as familiar. But this was different. This had definition, structure, intent. He considered throwing the plate away, telling the Hutchins family it had been damaged in development. But professional pride stopped him, and curiosity, that damnable curiosity that had led him into too many dark places in his life. Blackwell wrapped the glass plate carefully in cloth and set it aside with the others. He'd give it to them tomorrow, he decided. Let them see it and make their own judgment. Perhaps they'd notice nothing unusual. Perhaps the figure in the shadows would be invisible to everyone but him. But Thomas Blackwell didn't sleep that night. He lay on the cot Moses Harlan had provided, listening to the wind howl through the hollow and thinking about the figure in the photograph. About young Samuel's wandering eye. About the way Rebecca's hands had tightened as if gripping something unseen. About the grim set of Robert Hutchins's jaw, like a man who knew something terrible was coming and was simply waiting for it to arrive. Around 3 a.m, Blackwell heard sounds from the street outside. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, then whispers. Low voices speaking in a rhythm that didn't sound quite like conversation, more like chanting or praying. He rose and went to the window, pulling back the frost-covered curtain. The street was empty. The snow fell in silent curtains. Nothing moved. But in the fresh snow on the ground, he could clearly see footprints. Small ones, child-sized. Leading from the direction of the mountains, down the main street, and stopping directly outside Harlan's general store. Right below his window. The footprints ended there, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them, had simply vanished into the air. Morning came gray and reluctant. Blackwell went downstairs to find Moses Harlan already behind his counter, sorting through a shipment of tinned goods that had arrived before the heavy snows blocked the roads. "Sleep well?" Harlan asked without looking up. "No," Blackwell admitted. "Strange sounds last night." Harlan's hands paused for just a moment over the tins. "What kind of sounds?" "Footsteps. Voices, like children outside." The store owner's face hardened. "Ain't no children ought to be out at night in Crow's Hollow. Not this time of year. Not ever, really." "Why not?" Harlan set down the tin he'd been holding and finally met Blackwell's eyes. "You're just passing through so you wouldn't know. But folks around here, we don't talk about certain things, and we don't let our children wander after dark. There's rules in these mountains, Mr. Blackwell. Old rules. Break 'em and things happen." "What kind of things?" "The kind we don't talk about." Harlan turned back to his inventory, making it clear the conversation was over. The Hutchins family returned that afternoon as promised. Robert, Jacob, Rebecca, and young Samuel, all wearing the same grim expressions they'd worn for the photograph. Blackwell had their glass plate wrapped and ready, along with 2 paper prints he'd made that morning. "Here you are," he said, handing over the package. "One of my better compositions, if I say so myself." Robert took the package without comment, but Rebecca reached for it, her green eyes sharp with something that might have been anticipation or dread. "Can we see it?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Blackwell hesitated, then nodded. He unwrapped one of the paper prints and held it out. They gathered around, the 4 of them, studying their own frozen faces. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Samuel's finger, small and trembling, rose to point at the shadowed corner of the image. "There," he whispered, his stutter momentarily gone. "You caught it. You caught the thing that watches us." Rebecca's face went pale. Jacob's hand moved instinctively to his father's shoulder, gripping tight. Robert stared at the photograph with an expression that Blackwell couldn't quite read. Fear, yes, but also something like resignation, or recognition. "You see it too?" Robert asked quietly, his eyes meeting Blackwell's. The photographer nodded slowly. "Then you should leave Crow's Hollow," Robert said. "Tonight, if possible, before the roads become impassable, before—" He trailed off, taking the photograph and wrapping it carefully, as if handling something sacred or cursed. "Before what?" Blackwell demanded. But the Hutchins family was already moving toward the door. Samuel tucked between his siblings like something precious that needed protecting. Rebecca paused at the threshold, looking back over her shoulder. "It knows you saw it now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the photograph. It knows, and things that know they've been seen. They don't like to leave witnesses." Then they were gone, swallowed by the gray November afternoon. Thomas Blackwell stood in the empty store, his hands trembling. Outside, the snow began to fall harder. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, moaning through the eaves like something alive and hungry. He thought about leaving, packing his equipment and taking his chances on the mountain roads before full dark settled over the hollow. But he didn't. Because despite everything, the figure in the photograph, the footprints in the snow, the Hutchins family's warning, Thomas Blackwell was a man of science and reason. He didn't believe in ghosts or mountain curses or things that watched from shadows. At least, he didn't want to believe. So he stayed. And as the sun set early over Crow's Hollow on November 15, 1894, casting the valley into its customary premature darkness, Thomas Blackwell made the decision that would seal his fate. He set up his camera one more time, this time pointed at the darkened corner of the room where the figure had appeared. If something was there, he would capture it properly, face it directly, prove it was nothing more than a trick of light and shadow. He prepared his glass plate, positioned his lamps, and waited. The room grew colder as night fell. His breath formed clouds in the air. The oil lamps flickered despite the lack of wind. And then, just as the town clock struck 9, he heard it. A sound from the corner where his camera was aimed. Soft footsteps, coming closer. The photograph Thomas Blackwell took that night would never be developed. But what happened in Harlan's general store between the hours of 9 and midnight would be whispered about in Crow's Hollow for generations to come. The kind of story people told in daylight, then refused to speak of after dark. The kind of story that kept children inside when the sun went down. The kind of story that began with a photograph and ended with a question that no one wanted to answer. What happens when you capture something on film that was never meant to be seen? And what does it do when it realizes you've been watching? They found Thomas Blackwell 3 days later. Moses Harlan discovered him on the morning of November 18th, when he unlocked the general store and found the back room door slightly ajar. The chemical smell hit him first, silver nitrate and developer solution mixed with something else. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in summer heat, though this was the dead of winter. Blackwell was sitting in his chair, perfectly upright, hands folded in his lap. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. At first, Harlan thought the man had simply frozen to death. The room was cold as a tomb, frost covering the windows in intricate patterns that looked almost deliberate. Almost like writing. But when Harlan touched Blackwell's shoulder, the body didn't move, didn't fall. It was rigid, locked in position as if rigor mortis had set in while he was still sitting upright. And his face, God help him, his face wore an expression that Moses Harlan would see in his nightmares for the rest of his life. Terror. Pure, absolute terror. But also something else. Recognition. As if in his final moments, Thomas Blackwell had understood something, seen something. And that knowledge had literally stopped his heart. The town doctor, Ezra Walsh, confirmed death by cardiac arrest, but Walsh was a drunk who'd lost his medical license in Virginia before washing up in Crow's Hollow. His hands shook as he examined the body, and he refused to look at Blackwell's face for more than a few seconds at a time. Natural causes, Walsh declared, his voice unsteady. Heart just gave out. Happens to men his age. He was 46, Harlan protested. And look at him, Ezra. Look at his face. Walsh wouldn't. He scribbled out a death certificate with trembling hands, took his fee, and left without another word. They buried Blackwell 2 days later in the cemetery at the edge of town, in frozen ground that took 4 men 6 hours to dig. The preacher said words over the grave, but his voice was rushed, anxious. Even the crows that normally gathered in the cemetery trees were absent. The silence was absolute. Only 7 people attended the burial: Moses Harlan, the preacher, 4 men who'd helped dig the grave. The Hutchins family did not come, but that night, Moses Harlan couldn't sleep. The image of Blackwell's face haunted him, the terror, the recognition, and something else that had been gnawing at him since finding the body. Blackwell's camera was still set up in the back room, still pointed at the darkened corner, and there was a glass plate in the holder, exposed but never developed. The last photograph Thomas Blackwell had taken. Harlan knew he should leave it alone. Destroy it. Throw the plate into the river and forget any of this had happened. But curiosity, that same fatal curiosity that had killed the photographer, drove him from his bed at 2 a.m. He went downstairs to the back room, lit an oil lamp, and stared at the camera. The black cloth hung limp over it like a shroud. The glass plate sat in its holder, waiting. Harlan had watched Blackwell develop photographs. He knew the basic process. The chemical baths were still there, though partially frozen. It would take time to warm them, but it could be done. "Leave it alone," a voice in his head warned. "Whatever Blackwell saw, you don't want to see it." But his hands were already moving, preparing the chemicals, warming them over a small flame. It took 3 hours to develop the plate. Harlan worked in near darkness, following the steps he'd observed. Submersion in one bath, then another, then the fixing solution. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the plate twice. When he finally lifted it from the final bath and held it up to the lamplight, his breath caught in his throat. The photograph showed the corner of the room. Empty, just shadows and the edge of the canvas backdrop. But as Harlan tilted the plate, catching the light at different angles, something emerged from the darkness of the image. Not a figure this time. Something else. Writing. Scratched into the glass plate itself, as if done from the inside of the image. Words in a child's unsteady hand. "We are the children who came before we are the price that was paid. We watch the hollow, we wait for more." Harlan dropped the plate. It shattered on the floor with a sound like breaking ice. He stumbled backward, his hip striking the table, sending bottles of chemicals crashing down. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. Children. A price. The hollow. And then, with horrible clarity, he remembered something old Silas Hutchins, Robert's grandfather, had told him years ago when Moses first came to Crow's Hollow. A story he'd dismissed as the ramblings of a senile old man. The founding of Crow's Hollow. It wasn't just a failed mining town. It had been something else first, something darker. In 1847, a group of settlers had come to this valley, led by a preacher named Ezekiel Crow. They were religious extremists fleeing persecution in Pennsylvania. They believed the world was corrupt, that salvation could only be found in isolation and purification. They built their settlement in the deep valley where sunlight barely reached. They called it Crow's Hollow after their leader. And for the first 2 years they thrived in their isolation. But the third winter was brutal. The snow came early and stayed late. Their crops failed. Their livestock died. By February, they were starving. Ezekiel Crow gathered the settlement and made a pronouncement. God was testing them. They needed to prove their faith through sacrifice. The ultimate sacrifice. They drew lots. 12 families. Each had to give up their youngest child. 12 children, between the ages of 4 and 10. On the night of February 14, 1850, those 12 children were led into a cave in the mountain above the hollow. A cave that went deep into the earth, where the settlers believed they could communicate directly with God. The children were never seen again. But that spring, miraculously, the weather broke early. Game returned to the forest. The crops that summer were abundant beyond measure. The settlement prospered. They told themselves it had worked. God had accepted their sacrifice. But the children, the 12 who had been taken into the mountain, they never left. They became the watchers, the protectors and the curse of Crow's Hollow. They existed in the spaces between light and shadow, in photographs and reflections, in the corner of your eye, and in the darkness that gathered when you were alone. Most people who lived in the hollow long enough learned not to see them, learned to look away when shadows moved wrong, learned to keep their own children inside after dark. But strangers, people like Thomas Blackwell, they didn't know the rules. They looked directly at what should never be seen. They tried to capture what should never be captured. And the children didn't like being seen. Moses Harlan understood now. The figure in the Hutchins family photograph wasn't randomly there. Young Samuel, with his wandering eye, could see them, had always been able to see them, and they were drawn to him because of it. That's why Robert Hutchins had that look of grim resignation. He knew what his son could see, knew what it meant. The children were always watching, always waiting. And when you acknowledged them, truly saw them and tried to prove they existed, you became part of their vigil. Forever frozen, like Thomas Blackwell, forever watching the hollow. Harlan ran. He fled the back room, the shattered glass plate crunching under his boots. He grabbed his coat and hat, and within minutes, he was hitching up his wagon in the freezing pre-dawn darkness. He would leave Crow's Hollow. Tonight, before the sun rose. Before anyone could stop him. But as he climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins, he saw them. Standing at the edge of the street, barely visible in the darkness before dawn. 12 small figures. Children, or what had once been children. Their proportions were wrong. Heads too large, limbs too long, like images stretched and distorted. Their faces were pale, almost luminous in the darkness, and they were all looking at him. The reins fell from Moses Harlan's trembling hands. One of the figures stepped forward. A girl, perhaps 8 years old when she'd been taken into the mountain 44 years ago. She opened her mouth, and a voice came out that sounded like wind through empty rooms. "You've seen us now. You've seen what we are. You can't leave, Mr. Harlan. No one leaves Crow's Hollow once they truly see." Spring came to the Appalachian Mountains in April of 1895. The snow melted, revealing the secrets winter had buried. Dead animals, mostly. A few personal items lost in the drifts. And in the cemetery at the edge of Crow's Hollow, 2 graves with fresh markers. Thomas Blackwell, traveling photographer. Moses Harlan, proprietor of the general store. Both dead of heart failure within 4 months of each other. Both found with that same expression of terminal terror frozen on their faces. The town had a new shopkeeper now, a cousin of Harlan's from Tennessee, who knew better than to ask too many questions. Life in Crow's Hollow continued as it always had, quiet, isolated, watchful. But 43 miles south in Asheville, in the offices of the North Carolina Historical Society, a package arrived in late May. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, the Society's chief archivist, opened it personally. Inside was a letter, written in an unsteady hand, dated November 17, 1894. It was from Thomas Blackwell, mailed the day before he died. "To whom it may concern, if you are reading this, I am likely dead. I've taken a photograph of something that shouldn't exist. I've included the glass plate in this package, wrapped carefully. I don't fully understand what I've captured, but I know it's important. The people of Crow's Hollow live under some kind of curse. There are children in the shadows, children who watch and wait. They appear in photographs. They can be seen by those with the gift, or the curse, of true sight. I've made a terrible mistake. I looked directly at them. I tried to prove they existed, and now I can feel them watching me, even as I write this. I can hear them outside my window. Please investigate this. Tell the world what happened here. Don't let these deaths be in vain. Thomas Blackwell." Dr. Hartwell set down the letter and carefully unwrapped the glass plate that had been packed with it. It was the Hutchins family photograph. She held it up to the light streaming through her office window, studying the 4 faces frozen in time. Robert Hutchins, stern and knowing. Jacob, protective. Rebecca, aware of something just beyond the frame. And young Samuel, his wandering eye looking toward. She tilted the plate, and there it was, the figure in the shadows. Small, child-sized, with proportions that made her stomach turn. It was clearer in direct sunlight than it must have been by lamplight, almost as if it wanted to be seen now, wanted its existence proven. Dr. Hartwell had been an archivist for 20 years. She'd seen hundreds of old photographs. She knew about double exposures, about tricks of light, about the tendency of the human mind to see patterns where none existed. But this was different. This was real. She made a decision that would alter the course of her life. Within a week, Dr. Hartwell had organized an expedition to Crow's Hollow. She brought 3 colleagues, a photographer, a historian, and a medical doctor. They would investigate Blackwell's claims, document everything, and either prove or disprove the existence of these shadow children. They arrived in Crow's Hollow on June 3, 1895. The town was exactly as Blackwell had described it, a deep valley where sunlight barely penetrated, wooden buildings weathered and dark, and a silence that felt almost aggressive in its totality. The new shopkeeper, Harlan's cousin, was polite but unhelpful. "Don't know nothing about no photographer," he said, his eyes not meeting theirs. "Don't know nothing about children in shadows. You folks should probably move along. Nothing to see here." But they didn't move along. They interviewed the townspeople, visited the cemetery, photographed the town. And on their third night, Dr. Hartwell insisted they visit the Hutchins family cabin, 4 miles up the mountain. The cabin was abandoned. The door hung open, creaking in the wind. Inside, furniture sat covered in dust. A table set for 4. Beds made but never slept in. It was as if the family had simply vanished mid-life. Dr. Hartwell's photographer, a young man named David Chen, set up his camera in the main room, wanting to document the scene. As he worked, the historian, Patricia Moore, found something in the corner, a journal, leather-bound, hidden under a loose floorboard. It belonged to Rebecca Hutchins. Patricia read aloud by lantern light as the others gathered around. June 1893. Samuel sees them now, every day, the children who watch our hollow. Father says it's a gift passed through our blood. Great-grandfather Silas saw them. Grandfather John saw them. Father sees them, though he pretends he doesn't. And now Samuel. They started appearing when he turned 11, in the corners of rooms, in the forest at dusk, in the reflection of the well water, always watching, always waiting. Father says we're descendants of Ezekiel Crow himself, that we carry the burden of what he did. The 12 children, they watch the hollow because of us, because of the blood we share with the man who sent them into the mountain. They want Samuel. I know they do. They want another to join their vigil, another Crow bloodline child to watch the hollow forever. We can't let that happen. We won't. The journal entries continued, becoming more desperate as time went on. Rebecca wrote about her family's attempts to protect Samuel, about considering leaving the hollow. But the final entry, dated November 16, 1894, was the most chilling. The photographer saw them. He captured one in his photograph, and now they're restless. They appear more frequently, more boldly. Last night, Samuel said they spoke to him. They told him the price has changed. One stranger saw them and died. Another stranger saw them and will die. But the debt isn't settled. They want their price. They always do. Father has made a decision. Tomorrow night we leave the hollow. We'll go west, where the mountains end and the children can't follow. We'll change our names. Disappear. But if we fail, if the children take Samuel, I want whoever finds this journal to know the truth. Crow's Hollow was built on sacrifice. 12 children gave their lives so this valley could prosper. But they never truly died. They became something else. Something that watches and waits and demands payment. Every generation the hollow must give them what they want. Usually it's subtle. A child who wanders too far in the woods. A stranger who asks too many questions. They take what they're owed, and the town survives. But our family carries the original sin, the Crow blood. And they want us most of all. If you're reading this, run. Leave this place. Don't look for us. Don't try to save us. Some prices once paid can never be refunded. The journal ended there. Dr. Hartwell and her team sat in silence, the weight of Rebecca's words settling over them like a shroud. David Chen, the photographer, finally spoke. "We need to leave. Tonight. This isn't research anymore. This is dangerous." But Dr. Hartwell shook her head. "We need proof. We need to document this for Thomas Blackwell, for the Hutchins family, for all the people who've died because of this curse." "How?" Patricia Moore asked, her voice trembling. "How do we prove something like this?" Dr. Hartwell looked at David's camera, sitting on its tripod in the corner of the abandoned cabin. "We photograph them, just like Blackwell did. We capture them on glass plate and bring that evidence back to civilization. We expose this secret." "That's what Blackwell tried," David protested. "It killed him." Blackwell was alone. We're four. We'll be more careful. They stayed in the cabin that night. As darkness fell over Crow's Hollow, that deep, premature darkness that defined the valley, they prepared. David set up his camera. Patricia laid out Blackwell's original photograph as reference. The doctor, William Foster, kept detailed notes. And Dr. Hartwell waited. Around midnight, the temperature dropped. Their breath became visible, frost forming on the cabin windows despite it being June. The oil lamps flickered, though there was no wind. Then they heard it. Footsteps. Small ones. Outside the cabin, circling slowly. David's hands shook as he positioned himself behind the camera. They're here. The door, which they'd closed and barred, slowly swung open. 12 figures stood in the doorway. Children, but not children. Pale, distorted. Their eyes black and reflective, like those of animals caught in lamplight. The one in front, the girl who'd spoken to Moses Harlan, stepped inside. "You want to see us?" Her voice was that same wind-through-empty room sound. "You want proof we exist?" Dr. Hartwell found her voice. "Yes, we want the truth. We want the world to know what happened here." The girl tilted her head, the movement too fluid, too wrong. "The truth is a price, Dr. Hartwell. Everything in Crow's Hollow has a price, knowledge, safety, life itself." "What price?" Dr. Hartwell demanded. "The same price it's always been. The same price it will always be." The other children moved into the cabin, surrounding the four researchers. "Doctor?" Foster tried to back away and found himself unable to move, as if his legs had turned to stone. The girl continued. 45 years ago, 12 children walked into a mountain and never came out. We became the watchers, the guardians of this hollow. We keep the valley prosperous. We keep the outsiders away. We maintain the balance. "But you kill people," Patricia whispered. "We collect the price," the girl corrected. "Those who see us and try to prove we exist, they become part of the vigil. Forever watching, forever part of Crow's Hollow." "Like Thomas Blackwell," Dr. Hartwell said. "Like Thomas Blackwell. Like Moses Harlan. Like the Hutchins family." "The Hutchins family?" Dr. Hartwell's blood went cold. "What happened to them?" The girl smiled, and it was the most terrible thing any of them had ever seen. "They tried to leave. Tried to take Samuel away from us. He could see us so clearly, you understand. The gift of the Crow bloodline. We couldn't let that go." She gestured to the corner of the cabin. 4 figures materialized from the shadows. Robert Hutchins, Jacob, Rebecca, Samuel. But like the 12 children, they were wrong now, pale, distorted, their eyes black and empty. "They're watchers now too," the girl said. "Forever part of the vigil, forever part of Crow's Hollow." Dr. Hartwell felt the weight of her mistake. She'd come seeking truth, seeking to expose a secret. But some secrets existed for a reason. Some truths were meant to stay buried. David's camera flashed. He'd triggered it in panic or desperation. The magnesium powder illuminated the cabin in a burst of blinding white light. When the light faded, the children were gone. All of them. The 12 watchers and the 4 Hutchins family members. Vanished as if they'd never been. The 4 researchers stood alone in the cabin, hearts hammering, minds reeling. "Did we—" David couldn't finish the sentence. "Doctor." Hartwell moved to the camera, her hands shaking. "Develop the plate. Now. We got them. We have proof." They worked through the night. By dawn, they had the photograph developed. David held it up to the early morning light streaming through the cabin window. It showed the 4 of them, Dr. Hartwell, Patricia, William, and David, standing in the cabin. And surrounding them, perfectly captured on glass plate, were the 12 children and the 4 Hutchins family members. 16 ghosts. 16 watchers. 16 souls trapped in eternal vigil, the proof they'd come for. But as they prepared to leave, to pack up their equipment and flee Crow's Hollow with their evidence, David noticed something about the photograph. Something wrong. In the image, Dr. Hartwell's eyes were already turning black. Patricia's face was already beginning to pale. William's proportions were already starting to shift. And David himself, in the photograph, was already looking toward the shadows, with the fixed stare of the eternal watchers. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no!" Dr. Hartwell took the photograph from his trembling hands. She saw it too. The transformation had already begun. Not in their physical bodies yet, but in the image, in the truth that had been captured. They'd gotten their proof. But the price was their souls. They never left Crow's Hollow. The North Carolina Historical Society received one final package in July of 1895. It contained the glass plate photograph showing Dr. Hartwell's team surrounded by the shadow children. It contained Rebecca Hutchins's journal, and it contained a note in Dr. Hartwell's handwriting. Some truths should never be exposed. Some prices should never be paid. Forget Crow's Hollow. Forget the shadow children. Forget us. This is our final warning. There are places in this world where the veil is thin, where old sins create permanent scars, where the price of knowledge is your very soul. Do not come looking for us. Do not try to save us. We are the watchers now. We will always be the watchers. The Historical Society, unsure what to make of the package, filed it away in their archives. The photographs were too disturbing to display, the journal too fantastical to be believed. Crow's Hollow was marked on maps as the abandoned settlement. The few remaining residents drifted away over the next decade. By 1905, the valley was empty. But even now, more than a century later, there are stories. Hikers who venture too deep into those mountains sometimes report seeing abandoned buildings in a valley where the sunlight never quite reaches. They report feeling watched. They report seeing children in the shadows, children who don't move quite right, whose eyes reflect light like an animal's. Most of them leave quickly and never speak of it again. But some, the curious ones, the ones who try to photograph what they've seen, the ones who try to prove the impossible, they're never heard from again. Because in Crow's Hollow, the watchers are still waiting, still collecting their price, still maintaining their eternal vigil. And somewhere, in the archives of the North Carolina Historical Society, a glass plate photograph sits in a forgotten box. If you were to look at it closely, if you were to tilt it in the light and really study the faces of those shadow children, you might notice something disturbing. The number of watchers has grown. 12 became 16 in 1895, and every few decades when someone gets too curious, when someone tries to expose the truth, the number grows again. Because some photographs capture more than images. Some photographs capture souls. And once you're in the picture, you're part of the vigil forever. The end.